All right, everyone. I will be teaching you about the reading theorist Mary Helen Immordino Yang. You can find most of the information about her in our text in chapter 7 titled Effective Lenses. Before I move to the next slide, I want to explain what is going to be expected of you. I'm going to show you two different photographs, and I want you to think about the first emotion that pops into your head when you see those photographs. So here's the first one. When you're looking at that photograph, how does it make you feel? And I want you to tuck that emotion into the back of your head because we will circle back to this towards the end of the presentation. And then here's the last photo, and I want you to look at it and again think what does the photo make you feel? What's the first emotion that pops into your head? Remember those emotions because we will be coming back to them. Next thing on the presentation to-do list is I want you to stop here and follow the link that is sent to you in the notes for this presentation to the Google form, where I'm going to ask you to reflect on your educational journey up into this point. And so you have kind of two different avenues you can take when answering the reflection questions. You can either answer them with the reflection of you were a student growing up, or you can look at it through the lens of how you feel currently as a student right now in grad school. I hope that you've noticed a sort of theme so far with the word emotion, because that's going to give you some insight into who Immordino Yang is and what she stands for. Which brings me to her. So I wanted to start with her background just so you kind of understand the lens that which she's doing her research through and her sort of understanding and how she processes the field of education. So she is a professor of education, psychology, and neuroscience at the University of Southern California, as well as the founding director of the USC Center for Effective Neuroscience Development, Learning, and Education. So she is spearheading the kind of intermixing of the field of neuroscience with education. So she has a very strong background in not just education, but also the psychology of education and the neuroscience of education. Very smart woman. So I took a look at some of her research and tried to pick apart sort of her overall themes of what she stands for, what she understands, and what she wants educators, to really get from her research to try to apply within the field. So starting off, she won a early career award in 2014 for her findings in neuroscience and education. So she's definitely a pioneer within that field. So here are some of the findings that she had that won her that award. The first one being that deep understanding comes from making emotional connections with content. And emotions, you've heard that word already a few times, is really what she's all about. She also kind of ties in her background in psychology with pairing emotion to motivation. And she strongly believes that motivation comes from not just cognitive skills, but those positive emotions that we associate with cognitive skills and therefore meaningful experiences. She also believes that when students are completing academic tasks, emotional values are going to be associated with them. Sometimes that can be positive association, or sometimes that can be negative, but regardless, emotional associations are going to be attached to academic tasks. She also believes that we can no longer simply look at education as just purely cognitive. There is more to it than just learning the standards, the facts, the information. Every time we learn, our emotions as well as our social and cultural backgrounds play a role in our understanding and our meaning making that happens when we are learning. She also talks a lot about the why behind learning and how the value that we place within learning, like things like math and reading, those are inherently emotional. So a lot of our motivation is tied with our emotions as well. So I took a look at a study that her and some colleagues did and kind of took apart some of the key factors that lined up with what our text was teaching us about Mary Helen Immordino Yang. And I broke down just the important elements of a small portion of this overall study. And so I looked at one example that she wrote about, and that was looking at 8 to 12-year-old students that were from Switzerland. And the population that they looked at, they split into two groups. There was a Montessori schooled youth group, and then there was a traditionally schooled youth group as well. And so what they did was they gave both groups the same math activity, and then they tracked their neural activities while they were completing that task to see sort of how their brains were processing the task, any emotions that might have been triggering while they were completing the task, and so forth. And so they noticed that they scored very similar on the activity that they were given, but their neural activities were vastly different in how they approached and therefore completed the task. So what I did was I broke down some of the key elements that happen with the Montessori students compared to the traditionally schooled students. And so what they found in the Montessori students was that they showed neural reactions when they were given a challenging problem. So when they got to a problem they maybe weren't sure how to solve, or they'd solved and they'd gotten it incorrect. So they did have neural reactions to it, but not the same as traditionally schooled students. When traditionally schooled students got to a challenging problem, they had a neural reaction as well, but it was associated with negative emotions. And that's going to play a pretty key role in the overall findings of the study that I'll cover on the next slide. So when the Montessori students had those neural reactions to challenging problems, the way they approached that was by reorganizing their strategy to solve the problem in a new way. So sure, they saw their brain light up when they got to a challenging problem, but it wasn't necessarily associated with a negative feeling. It just simply their brains came up with a new solution. They implied their critical thinking skills and found a new way to try to approach this situation. They also indicated that they learned from their mistakes. And instead of that, again, being associated with, oh, we got it wrong, it's a negative feeling, it simply just fueled them to come up with a better, different, more informed way of solving the problem the next time. So even though the Montessori students scored similar to the traditionally schooled students, the Montessori students ended up attempting more problems overall, because when they would get to those challenging problems that whether they got wrong or they were just overall hard for them, they continued to try to rework the problem until they got to the correct answer. So on the other side here, looking at the traditionally schooled students, what they noticed as they went through this experience was they had neural reactions to correct answers, signaling similar to memorization and positive association. So a lot of what they were seeing was when those students were getting something correct, their brains were lighting up in making it as in they were trying to memorize that pattern or that feeling so that they could continue to apply it to the next problem and the next. As previously mentioned, when they would get to a challenging problem or a problem they got incorrect, they would be signaling those negative emotions. And what that led to was they did not have any attempts at restructuring their strategy to try to solve an unknown problem. That negative feeling came in and they left it there. They did not try to rework or try a new way to solve that problem. And as previously stated, they did receive similar scores to this other group, but they did not attempt as many unfamiliar problems because they got to the challenge, felt the negative emotion, and then they avoided those problems. They skipped them altogether or they just moved on. So what this study kind of really tells us is that the authors, the researchers, they discovered that Montessori students overall got more out of that activity because they were more engaged in the critical thinking skills, problem solving skills, collaborative skills, because when they would get to a challenging problem, they didn't have any negative emotions associated with quote unquote failure. And so they just continued to rework the problem without that being a big deal. Whereas the traditionally schooled students avoided challenging problems because of that emotional feeling, the negative emotional feeling that they got when they were getting a problem wrong. And so what that really tells us as educators is that classroom environment and culture, it plays a role in how students are going to approach their learning. Those emotions that we have, it affects our motivation to want to keep trying or to ultimately give up. And that is what we saw in those two populations. Because they looked at a Montessori school, a lot of sort of their philosophy was more exploration based, and that learning is very collaborative, low stakes, as in there's no tests, there's no grades involved. And because they were used to that atmosphere of, okay, well, we don't know it right off the bat, let's continue to explore, let's continue to discuss and collaborate to find a new way, they were ultimately able to have better learning results and experiences, which therefore is associated with more positive emotions overall. So that study lines up pretty much perfectly with what Mary Helen Immordino Yang believes in. And so what I'm going to go through the next couple of slides are some of her just overall beliefs in, based off of some of her research, sort of what that looks like now, just overall in the field of education. So it's important to know that it's already understood that to truly have a cognitive connection to content, meaning has to take place, and background knowledge plays a part in that. But what Immordino Yang kind of brings to that discussion is that our emotional connections are just as important in building that background knowledge and making those cognitive connections as anything else. And so for truly intrinsic motivation to happen, for students to want to learn, we have to make sure that they're having a positive or just an overall emotional connection to the information that they are being expected to learn. On this slide, I have a quote that I think really just sort of sums up who Immordino Yang is and what she stands for. And that's stated here. It says, "It is literally neurobiologically impossible to build memories, engage complex thoughts, or make meaningful decisions without emotions." And that's exactly what she is all about as a theorist. In the book, she had mentioned that even simple decisions that we make day to day, sure, they can be backed in, information, whether it's facts or past experience, but they are still paired with our emotions, how they make us feel. And one of the examples she used was voting for the president. So sure, when we go to make that big decision, hopefully it's based in facts, things that we've read, learned, watched, whatever it may be. But it's also ultimately an emotional decision just as much as it's a cognitive one. And she also ties in a lot of her psychological background by looking at motivation and sort of our why. Why do we learn? Why do we come to school every day? Why do we continue to try to attempt a task, especially if it's difficult? And her sort of understanding is that we are all motivated by different factors, and each one can invoke an emotional association with them. And so something that she talks about in the book is sort of why are we motivated to learn? And some of the things that she says is maybe we're motivated because our parents support that. They put value in education. And so we do as well. Some of us are motivated because when we receive a good grade, that makes us feel proud, that makes us feel confident, makes us feel smart. And we crave that. We want to continue to have those emotional reactions. Consequently, some of us are motivated by negative emotions. Maybe that's fear of failure or fear of disappointment to our parents. And so she really stands by that emotion is connected to motivation when we are learning. And so what I have is some classroom applications. So what does this really look like then in our classrooms day to day? And what I took away from this is that we are constantly, as teachers, progress monitoring our students. We are assessing them on academic successes, milestones, and different sort of standards that they need to meet academically. But as teachers, we also need to be very aware of the emotional needs that our students have as well, especially in association to motivation and making those deeper meanings. If students have an emotional connection to what they are learning, Mary Helen Immordino Yang's research has proven time and time again that they will not only be more motivated to continue to want to learn and explore that content, but they'll make deeper connections and meaning, and therefore the learning will have more value in it because of their ties to emotion that they are having. One suggestion that I have within the classroom that can help us to sort of just tap in a little bit more to our students and their emotions towards learning is to give them attitude surveys, especially on ELA skills like reading and writing, because those surveys can give us some deep insight as to the emotions that our students currently do associate with different literacy skills. So I have attached in the tools and the sort of resources of this presentation a reading attitude survey that I have personally used in the past called the Garfield Reading Attitude Survey. And it's very easy to use. It basically asks the students a handful of questions, both pertaining to recreational reading as well as academic reading. And it's a great tool for teachers to use because it opens up a conversation of dialogue and lets you really know how your students feel about literacy skills. And that is then information that you can use to just better inform your instruction, because we know, because Mary Helen Immordino Yang's research supports it, that emotional connection to content is just as important as cognitive connection. And it also is then deeply connected to students' motivation. So we want to be aware of not just what skills they have cognitively, but also their emotional associations they're making throughout the learning day. So some final thoughts to wrap up this presentation here. In the beginning, I had asked you to look at these two pictures and then sort of what emotion pops into your brain first. And the reason that I had did that was to try to kind of seal the deal and prove the point that Immordino Yang makes throughout her research and her career. And that is that it is very hard to go through your day-to-day actions and taking in content and looking at new things, processing new things without an emotion associated with them. These are two very different pictures, and you probably had two very different emotions associated with them. But regardless, while your brain was trying to make meaning of these photos, taking in the details, how those photos made you feel also played a very important role within your brain's consumption of what was happening in the photo. And that's exactly what Mary Helen Immordino Yang stands for as a reading theorist. She stands firm with the idea that our emotional connections play a role in not just how we consume and better understand making deep connections with content, but also how it helps us to be motivated. Thank you for listening.